Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nature and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Don Murphy. In this episode, we'll be talking about cancer. We're going to discuss the history of cancer, some of the causes of cancer, the recent advances in research in cancer and cancer care. And we're also going to talk about a very interesting subject, and that's how the evolution of cancer and human evolution are inextricably bound together. I recently sat down with Dr. Wehbie and Dr. Anderson, who are two oncologists at the University of North Carolina Rex Cancer Care Center. We're going to begin our discussion with Dr. Wehbie, who has 20 years of experience, and then Dr. Anderson, who has 40 years of experience in cancer care. So let's get started. So thank you, Dr. Anderson, Dr. Wehbie, for joining me here. I really appreciate it. I know you guys are real busy, but I guess our audience should know one of the reasons why I'm doing this is because you were my oncologist. I had a bout with cancer, and now it was successful treatment. But I do a podcast, of course, and that's why we're having this discussion. So I want to hear from you about cancer treatment, the future of cancer treatment, but also as clinicians, how you got involved with becoming doctors and in particular cancer research in the first place. So Dr. Wehbie, why don't you tell us why you became a doctor and got involved with cancer?
Okay, I guess to try to make what seems like a long story short, very enamored by science as a high school student, undergraduate, wanted to go to graduate school. Someone convinced me to apply to a joint MD, PhD program. I looked at the MD part as just sort of to augment the science, worked in a lab, and then, chose finishing that program, chose a medical discipline that I thought would augment basic science, and was on that route during the HIV epidemic then, and sort of got really, and became an ID fellow, infectious disease fellow, was very involved in HIV care and a lot of patients with tumors, Kaposi sarcoma and some other things, and so decided to do oncology to augment some basic science stuff I was doing in that. And
sorry to interrupt, but why don't you tell our listeners what exactly oncology is? I try to make sure that people understand what we're talking about. We hear oncology and about oncologists, but what is it exactly?
So oncology is the subspecialty in internal medicine that deals with cancers, both liquid tumors like leukemias and lymphomas, and solid tumors, we call them, like lung cancer, colon cancer. And they're medical oncologists, internal medicine people who get subspecialty training in medical oncology. They're radiation oncologists, they're surgical oncologists,
Right.
gynecologic oncologists. So, but oncology as a field just deals with cancers.
Right, and you're mostly in chemotherapy side of things, is that right? Or
Correct.
so chemotherapy oncologist, and Dr. Anderson here. Why don't you tell us how you got involved first in your radiation oncologist?
Yeah, I had a pretty circuitous route there in some ways. I grew up in Durham, North Carolina. My father was a professor at Duke, and I was surrounded by doctors in my community. And actually, one of my childhood friends was a very prominent cardiovascular pathologist named Don Hackle. And he used to take us over to his lab, and I always remember this one incident where he was very interested in lots of different aspects of physiology. At that time was a big part of the field. And I remember he was studying, I think, kidney function in sand rats. So he had all these sand rats running around. So he took one out and says, "Oh, I want to show you, a beating heart or something. He takes some chloroform, puts it on a little rat, and it goes out, and then he takes the little scissors and cuts it open, and opens it up. He said, whoa, we see the little heart beating. But anyway, in his basement, my friend and I, we had a chemistry lab there, and I saw I got very interested in science from that. I also had another physician up the street, who's a very prominent cardiovascular surgeon, cardiovascular surgeon. His name was Will Seeley, and he was really a pioneer in electrophysiology of the heart. And he had a little team, and I think Dr. Hackley even worked with him as well. And they basically addressed treating a syndrome called Wolff-White-Parkinson syndrome, which is a reentrant arrhythmia in the heart. And they actually had to they do open heart surgery, and then they have to find out where the little nerves are the cause of the problem, and they seal it off, and you fix it. So that was sort of an experience I had from just being around those.
So just exposure as a youth is one of the things that inspired you, and then you just had a natural maybe proclivity or inclination towards.
I was actually more interested in becoming a biochemist. We actually had another, though I never really knew him very well, we had another gentleman named Phil Handler who lived across the street from us, who later became the president of the National Academy of Sciences, and he wrote a very prominent textbook in biochemistry. And for whatever reason, I always thought biochemistry was sort of an interesting field, so I was sort of interested in doing that. But at the end of the day, as I went through, I was a chemistry major. We didn't have biochemistry at that time, and I think right the summer before I went to medical school, I was working in a biochemistry lab, and it was interesting, but I think I sort of drifted more toward people and away from the lab. So that's sort of how I ended up.
I understand. Yeah. So how long have you two been practicing medicine, Dr. Wehbie?
Well, define practicing, I guess.
Seeing patients as a clinician?
I guess I started my internship in 1988, so, 30 years.
Mm-hmm. Right. And
I'm a little older, 40. I've been 43 years. I did my internship in internal medicine in 1981-82, and then went on and did my residency the following 3 years after that.
So we're here to talk about cancer, and you did me a great service as I was going through my treatment and recommended that I read a book, The Emperor of All Maladies.
Yes.
It's a famous book about cancer. Even goes into the history of cancer. So I kind of got a two-level question here that deals with what is cancer exactly, both historically and now. And then there's always been this fear, it seems to me. You say cancer and there are all these reactions, and most of them can be defined as fearful. And a lot of people try to avoid even telling people they have cancer. They become very secretive and don't even share the fact that they have this illness. I'd like to hear from you, maybe both of you, and maybe start with you, Dr. Wehbie, why you think that is. But beginning with what cancer is.
Well, what cancer is a very complex thing, and I would just say that maybe this is beyond the short answer, but I believe God made us, or we evolved, whichever your bent of how you think about that is we are what we are because our genome is intrinsically unstable, right? So so if we had a completely stable genome, we'd still be a one-cell organism in some liquid base in some place, but it's the instability in our genome that over the millennium drove us through God's hand or not to be what we are, and that instability is still there. So and the instability brings dividends. It also brings cancer, and so it's the cell replication, the imperfect replication, the mistakes that are made, the proofreading mechanisms, inability to find all those mistakes, the the, carcinogenic things in our environment that lead to mutations and under selective pressure, increased growth rate and abnormal cell function, and that's cancer.
Right, that leads to tumor,
Yes.
that leads to what you were talking about earlier, liquid type of cancers like leukemia as well. So this instability in our genome, or another way of saying that, in our DNA, and the copying and replication of that DNA within the cell then leads to different types of cancers, and then they have to be treated in different ways. But historically, cancer is nothing new. I mean, this book that I mentioned earlier, it seems that cancer has been with us for a very long time, going back to ancient times.
Yeah, and if you look at our view of cancer hundreds of years ago, a few decades ago, a few years ago, it changes as we are able to speciate different things. I mean, at one time a bird was a bird, but now there's so many,
Species,
you recognize that. And, there was one type of lung cancer. Now as we've understood things, we know there's more types of lung cancer. So, that.
Right.
And at one point, cancer was felt to be infectious, so people would avoid people with cancer.
I see.
So.
Yeah, I don't think I picked up on that before, or even in reading the book. I'm sure he mentioned it in that book, but the fact that people thought it was something that you could catch, that it was, but it was infectious. Wow, and I think there's probably still some of that in society in certain areas as well.
I think so. I think in some ways, the way we understand the world, we've crawled out of the cave, and in some ways we haven't.
Right.
But we do have some viral vectors for it.
Certainly, yeah.
And it's building on that book. There's another book that author wrote. It's called The Song of the Cell. And I think the way you described it as well, he writes of that very much, this idea that it's by the whole process of our reproduction of cells, and that's the whole concept here, is you're going to have mistakes, and that leads to evolution, and that's why unfortunately the reason we're here is because of it, but unfortunately the same reason, that's why we're going to always have cancer.
So you say always, so you both seem to be intimating that you think cancer is something that's going to be with us for as long as we're evolving as a species. However, there are those that feel like we have to find a cure for cancer. I mean, you hear about the war on cancer, the battle against cancer. I just read a meme that constantly comes up on Facebook where this lady was resenting the fact that cancer patients are always characterized as being in a battle or a war. And it's something that she very much resented. But there seems to be this societal feeling that, okay, this is an enemy, and we've got to fight this enemy, and we've got to conquer it, and there has to be a cure. And millions, if not billions, of dollars have been spent trying to find, quote, a cure. Is that realistic?
Finding a cure, is a cure realistic?
Yes.
I think you have to try to focus human thought on a goal, and if you preface that within the context of a battle, and I think that's why, the war against cancer, the war against things, I think it's prefaced, it's that way. But in controlling cancer, it's a multi-level thing that transcends just, science. Jimmy Carter, the guinea worm. If you think of cancers in terms of infectious diseases, which I tend to do as an ID doc, too, there's treating the infection, there's preventing the infection, there's this huge public health thing. I mean, probably 3/4 of all cancers could be prevented or treated early or cured with just public health things, certain vaccines, screening. That's 3/4 of cancers. But you know, syphilis is still not controlled in the world, and it's still easily treated with penicillin and easily preventable. So, I mean, I think we as a society, as a species, I mean, there's a scientific part that we can talk about that, you know, seems doable, maybe not, but it's, as I've gotten older and dealt with patients and dealt with the world and everything else, I think there's a whole acceptance of public health and public health measures and lifestyle things that seems to me more daunting than to figure out the scientific way of dealing with a cancer.
No, that's interesting. So you gave some an indication of the percentage that you thought. So you think that a significant number of cancers in the population could be detected earlier?
I think the estimate is that, you know, in aggregate with screening, lifestyle modifications, and like human papillomavirus vaccine and some other things, but public health things in place, that's 3/4 of all cancers.
Right. Well, I have to say that I'm a witness to that because through screening and seeing my ENT, my particular cancer, which is caused by the human papillomavirus, was found early, treated with chemotherapy and with radiation. Why? How do the two of you as clinicians, and I think a lot of cancer patients want to know this, is how do you decide on the protocol that you're going to use for treating a particular cancer? So you're a radiation oncologist. How do you make the decision? Okay, you get an ENT that says, my patient has this particular kind of tumor, perhaps in the throat or somewhere else, and then you have to make a decision, how am I going to treat this?
Well, you know, a lot of this, a lot of it goes back into historical precedents. I mean, we go way back to, you know, when literally 5 years after Roentgen discovered the X-ray, people were thinking, well, maybe we can use this to treat cancer, and that's obviously has been this incremental, just empirical stumbling forward to find things that are successful in treatment. Certainly with radiation, it was, you know, you look back in the 1920s, in some ways we were even doing things then that we're doing today, but just in much more sophisticated ways. So certainly I think, you know, a lot of these protocols have all risen over time. Though certainly probably for cancer, the mainstay has always been sort of surgery. You know, you got this growth coming out of your neck or your wherever in part of your body, and then you try to cut it out. And then since that time, I think as science has evolved, and certainly medical oncology is a good example, we're using chemistry and biochemistry to attack these tumors and find agents that are the tumors will respond to. And I think certainly the first ones were these leukemias because they're so sensitive to some of these alkylating agents. But over time, we've proceeded on to develop these protocols have gotten more sophisticated. We just sort of able to decide, you know, make decisions and how we do this in many ways. Now in the current time period, we use the idea of the randomized controlled trial. So you try to put one group of patients, then like the standard therapy, and then a new therapy that there's some reason to believe it might be better, it's going to be more efficacious. So you run a trial where you try to have equivalent patients go to both those arms, and then you pick the arm that says, well, this shows this is doing better than that, or if it's just as good, or if it's not as good. And so using all these piecemeal trials, we develop these pathways. And sometimes it's purely empirical, just one was decided years ago, and gosh, it works, and we just keep using that.
Well, that's fascinating because Dr. Wehbie, you and I had this discussion, I think one of the last times that I saw you, and you quietly said to me, well, same thing that you're saying, well, you know, historically we developed these protocols, and we didn't question them for a while. So in my case, I think is a good example, because we were doing both radiation and chemotherapy, and at some point you decided enough chemotherapy. And why did you make that decision in your decision-making process as a clinician? At some point you said, okay, I think we need to stop here.
I think most people, well, I think you would like to ideally in medicine in general and oncology and specific make evidence-based decisions. And the most important thing in cancer care are clinical trials that give you an idea of what works and doesn't work. And they have been the mainstay, as Dr. Anderson said, of moving what we do in oncology forward. You know, something can be a wonderful idea in the lab and never pan out. But you know if it's right or wrong based upon what the clinical trial shows. Sometimes the clinical trials are overdone, like you get, 6 months of therapy, and then later on more trials are done to show 3 months of therapy. So that decision about limiting what is done is based upon some clinical trial data. If someone has an incurable disease, an incurable cancer, you're more apt to use more art and things, or deviate from dosages and things. If someone has a curable thing, you really want to follow closely what the clinical trial did and how they did things. If you want to make a cake just like Betty Crocker did in the kitchen, you don't deviate very much. So that decision to back off is based upon clinical trial data.
Right, I understand. Well, it's interesting. Now you got trained as a biochemist, and now the approach, as I understand it, and from the papers that I've read recently, there's really a strong interest in understanding the biochemical and the molecular biology behind cancer development and tumor development. And so scientists are looking deeply into exactly what regulates tumor growth and tumor cell growth and that sort of thing. So do either of you believe that you will at some point migrate away from the need for radiation and chemotherapy, because you'll have a more refined understanding of exactly how cancer cells grow, both hard and liquid cancer, and then be able to develop new protocols and new treatments that might be successful?
Well, I'd certainly say the idea, in some ways, is, Dr. Wehbie applied can address this even better. It's this idea of targeted, if you can understand some pathways of how normal biology grows and how tumor grows, and you can target that pathway, that's certainly, with less side effects to the other normal cells, that's probably the way one wants to go. And from my own past experience, in my own field, we used to use a lot of radiation therapy for treatment of pediatric cancers, but it has awful long-term side effects on adolescents and children who have that. And really, right now, radiation oncology for pediatrics, our goal is to try to stop using it there if we can. So it's a good example where, in my own field, we're trying to move away from it there. Now, certainly, I think in a perfect world, if we could have a way to turn off these tumor cells by understanding there's certain biological pathways, we'll probably be moving toward that. But ironically, so far, we have a natural kind of ability to kill the tumors because of the fact that their ability to repair the radiation damage is going to be less than the normal cells, and that's what we're basically exploiting in terms of being able to kill the tumors. Though unfortunately we do leave these side effects from radiation, and certainly I think in the far future, you'd like to believe we have some more specific targeted agent that would kill the tumor with very little side effects to the underlying tissues.
Well, one of the things that I noticed, and this is maybe a question you could answer, is that these cancer cells seem to be smart. Like bacteria are smart, they can adapt. So I was reading a study recently where this targeted approach was being taken. The pathway was understood, treatment was given, a clinical trial was done, and during the trials they noticed that these cancer cells could adapt to the treatment. So even though they were targeted very much on a molecular biological level, and I don't want to get into too much detail and blow the mind of our listeners, but just say metabolic pathway for tumor development, these cancer cells have the ability to adapt even, and avoid treatment.
I think one concept that's important to realize in cancers and again in infectious diseases is the infection or the cancer is a swarm, it's a heterogeneous population. It's a clonal process. It starts from probably one cell or a few bacteria that infect you, but as the bacteria or the virus or whatever, or the cancer replicates, additional mutations occur. So you have a huge billions of cell population with diversity, we think randomly, and then you apply selective pressure, a single antibiotic or a single cancer drug, and that may kill 90% of the population, but then there's a subpopulation that then grows out. So we know to treat Mycobacterium tuberculosis, TB, that one drug doesn't work. You get a little bit of a response. So, all TB regimens are multi-drug. And almost all curative cancer therapies tend to be multi-drug or multi-modality. Radiation, surgery, new to the game is immunotherapy. And except for very, very few cancers, nothing has been as robust in curing cancers, treating cancers, as harnessing our immune system to do it, because our immune system evolved to hit multiple things, to kill, a range of things. So short of getting the immune system by itself to do the job, I think, curative therapies for cancers will still have to use multiple things, multiple drugs, or drugs and radiations, kind of a mixture of things.
But even in immunotherapies, which I've been looking at here recently in some recent papers, even those are difficult in the sense that cancer cells seem to even have the ability to avoid our immune system's attack on them. So as you're saying, because you have these huge populations of cells, you may, even with our immune system case, get 99% of them, but as long as you have 1% that you don't get, that 1% is significant with respect to the adaptability of.
And it certainly hasn't been the Holy Grail.
No.
I mean, it's cured people who are otherwise not curable, but then it's done nothing to some cancers.
No, absolutely.
And I just echo that, some of these things, thoughts. I mean, one thing that you were talking about, this idea of the war in cancer, in some ways there is this sort of war, you have this invading strange cell, this cancer cell, your body's immune system is trying to fight it, just like it's trying to fight in bacteria. So it's very interesting that parallels are our earlier concepts of even cancer really go back to infectious disease, about this idea of these mutations that are coming apart, and also some of our thinking of how many cells you have, how many logs you have to. We think of logs because when you think of the numbers of cells, we're 37 trillion cells, and when you see even a tumor this big, that's many billions of cells. So to kill it either with chemotherapy or with radiation, you're going to have to take away 0 or 2, or maybe you're just killing it down to such a small number that the body's immune system can finish off the last stragglers. But I think unfortunately no matter which therapy we have, I think what we're always faced with is the complexity that's the normal biology. And again, that hark back to that book, The Song of the Cell, very well speaks to this, just the complexity of how a normal cell operates. I still believe we have very, very limited understanding. It's just so complex. So many things are happening, and it's all simultaneously going on. And again, against this background, you have this evolution thing going on within this, be it a cancer cell or bacterial cell that's always out there making a new version of itself that can evade our therapies. Now, it is interesting. Generally, even when you have these different invasions, radiation therapy, it's not more of a physical process. So it's no matter what the new altered genomic form of the cancer is, if you get enough radiation that you can kill, you'll tear up that DNA and they die. Right. But the problem is you just can't take it to the point that the normal cells next door to it. You can't survive. And we can even kill bacteria with radiation, but it takes a lot of dose of radiation to do that.
I think what we found out over time, in science, and hopefully this will change one day, but the human genome and understanding things has almost been, the more you know, the more we find we don't know. Right.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. And it's so true. The more we know, the more we don't know. I want to thank our two guests, Dr. Anderson and Dr. Wehbie, for joining us today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please go to our website at natureandsciencepodcast.com, hit that like button, and please subscribe. You can also subscribe here, of course. Next week on our podcast, we're going to be joined by Jessica Ostheim. She's a dietitian also with the University of North Carolina Rex Cancer Care Center. And she's going to talk about cancer and diet and what you can do to use a proper diet to prevent some cancers, and how to have the proper nutrition during your treatment of cancer as well. So please join us. As always, stay safe, share happiness, and remember, never stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.